Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be today. This is the collaboration webinar web event with Blockchain Australia and XDC Network. My name is Sean White. I will be introducing our fireside chat this morning, which will be followed by a very robust and rigorous panel. So I will hand over to Mr. Simon Callaghan, who is the CEO Director of Blockchain Australia, and Mr. Bryan Clark with the Australian Centre of International Trade and Investment. Both of these gentlemen are based in Australia, and they are both have given their time and their great expertise in covering what it means to be an Australian and dealing with the tokenisation for the real world of digital trade. So I might just hand that over, and in half an hour I'll be back, and we'll definitely push on with our hour of panel with perhaps some questions at the end. So thank you very much for attending, and let's kick this off.
Thanks, Sean. I greatly appreciate it, and excellent to be joined here by Bryan from ACITI. Has a wealth of knowledge in international trade and investment here to share with us today. And thank you everyone for joining, and XDC Network for organising and partnering with Blockchain Australia today. So Bryan, I might start with an easy one. Would you like to introduce yourself and give a bit of background on the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment?
Sure, and thanks very much, Simon and Sean, for inviting me along and having this fireside chat in the middle of summer in Australia. That's a great idea. I did suggest it should be beachside, but anyway, it's what it is. And Sean and I got to know each other a little bit last year through my work with the Australian Centre, where I was running a series of webinars around realising paperless trade. And that came about really because prior to that, I'd spent 2 years as a strategic advisor to the Australian Simplified Trade System Task Force, trying to improve what Australia is doing at its cross-border arrangements and the difficulties that traders face in compliance, both in Australia but at international level as well. And prior to that, I had spent a decade or a bit over with the Australian Chamber of Commerce as their Director of Trade and International Affairs and running the International Chamber of Commerce in Australia. And long way back before that, an agricultural background and agricultural industry advocacy work for the last towards 30 years now. Yes, bring quite a bit of conversations there, but I was really focused on this question around how do we realise paperless trade. And the Australian Centre was really an idea which had come about around Australia and its free trade agreements and what industry was doing in and out of ministerial offices and what have you. We thought there's an awful lot of knowledge, but it's not necessarily terribly public. And there's a lot of good academics who are doing work. There's a lot of good industry people who are doing work. A lot of people who are doing work that it's unseen. And so how can we elevate these things? And that's the purpose of the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment. It's to try and it's a not-for-profit. It's to try and bring together and elevate the conversations around trade and investment, both inbound and outbound, and Australia's relationships with its important trading partners as well. And we try to do that across 4 areas. We want to increase the access to information. We want to increase engagement and collaboration across the research fields, the industry and the government fields. We'd like to see increased scholarship towards these things. So where there are issues, perhaps there's some opportunities here for some new students and academics to do some work around it. How do we highlight those things and encourage the government to potentially invest in those things? And we undertake our own research and analysis to help industry and companies and the government along the way. So that's pretty much the introductory story, Simon.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bryan. And we touched in our earlier conversation offline about some of those silos that can occur. I've previously worked at the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. So interesting to hear, some of the background why ACITI exists and the work that you're doing. I might jump into something around trade finance, just to sort of talk more broadly, and we touched on this earlier before jumping online, around how trade finance enables the reduction of the blockchain technology in trade finance can reduce the speed and the costs associated with the supply chain management. We talked a little bit about the paper logs, that the paperwork that goes along with trade. I just thought perhaps we could start by just talking about your thoughts on the tokenization and potential use for software like XDC, but within the supply chain management and the trade process. What are some areas you think that blockchain might be useful?
Well, I think it's a very broad topic, and I'm not necessarily completely expert in trade finance, but the principal thing when you step back is, firstly, trade has gone on for an awfully long time in the history of the world, and the governments are actually the new feature, not the trade. And so then governments have put in place, a whole heap of barriers because they're interested in community protections, or they're interested in revenue collection through tariffs, or applications of GST or VAT equivalents around the world, for example. And they also want to make sure that legitimate traders can benefit as quickly as they can, and consumers are supported in their purchases. And that's not co-opted then by criminal behavior. And so there's an awful lot of that which goes on as well. And so you have this juxtaposition going on in the trade. But if you step back and say, well, what happens first is international trade, firstly, is it's not really different to domestic trade. So if you and I, Simon, are trying to do something, you will order a product from me. I will satisfy your order, send you back some information. We will exchange information first, and then it's likely that you will have made a payment to me, and on receipt of the payment, I might give you the goods and send them to you. Or that could have been done in a way which had a financing aspect to it. But if we think about this in terms of that, the trade is firstly a financial system and a legal system, and then it's the transfer of goods, then I think we can start to put things into the right order and be thinking around, well, why do we do what we do at the border? And could those things be done in a different location? And if we've got new and better technologies, the information sharing, the exchange of documents is centuries old. But we've got now some new technology. And so why are we thinking that the new technology is somehow should operate in a different way? But it does enable us, if we're thinking in a data-rich environment, is instead of the forms-based system that we've had in the past, could we have just a data-based system? And a lot of this adoption around blockchain has been firstly in the financial sector. You've obviously seen a lot of it around cryptocurrencies and the invention of, new currencies, if you like, ways to do business, but the transaction is still the same transaction, which is going on. And so if we can now think of things where instead of the physical, I can represent that in a way in a digital environment, and we can think of, if I can show that I'm dealing with my compliance, can I construct some smart contracts so that if something had to move from point to point and that's then satisfied, it automatically trips my payments or other compliance requirements, then I think it enables us to think a little bit differently around how international trade could be conducted. And as you pointed out, is at the moment that's a slow process, or a relatively slow process, of documents needing to be gathered, documents exchanged, information put into forms, some of which are standardized, some not. And there's been quite a lot of success in the financial field around this now, and we're seeing e-bills of lading and other success stories. but it's not translating yet all the way through the supply chain. So I think there's, some work to be done, and we have some opportunities and new developments, as we'll speak of later, around the model law on electronically transferable records, which may assist with this.
Yeah, and I strongly agree there. We're actually, there's a lot of talk in the finance application of this technology around the tokenization of real world assets. Well, this is the literal tokenization of real world assets, and looking at the efficiency gains, and as we've sort of talked about previously, the ability to speed up from a government perspective as well, so that goods are not getting stuck in ports, and the free flow of goods, and the boost to the GDP that will have as well. So maybe we'll touch on that model law, electronic MLETR. Sorry. I guess I'm curious if you've got any thoughts on how blockchain is potentially offering something different to cloud in respects to the trading system. We sort of talked around the efficiency there. So we could touch on the tokenization, the automation of payment processes, but also I think there's a security aspect as well. Within an immutable ledger, and accessibility. I don't know if you have any thoughts that you're happy to share a little broader on that.
Again, so many of the current systems are embedded around the concept of trust. And how do I trust that I'm dealing with, a person or a player who is reliable, who's going to pay me, who's going to be compliant in the right ways? And that historically has always been done with this forms-based process. I send a form to a government authority, they send something back. There are wet signatures applied, increasingly electronic signatures have been supported. The banking sector, again, has been a very big beneficiary of this, but it's not entirely sorted out just yet. And blockchain, as we discussed offline in preparation, Sean, is you've still got the garbage in, garbage out problem when you're dealing with information which originally resided outside the blockchain. If it was already inside the blockchain, then you can mine hard enough, or you can look hard enough, and you'll find the information, because it doesn't exist outside that one environment. But if the information is used for, say, trade compliance across the requirements of governments and multiple documents and what have you, then we've got to be moving from that forms-based process to a database process. And so then we need interoperability between the different systems which people might choose to use. And we need to make sure that we are trusted in a digital sense for that digital environment. So then what's my digital identity? Is that trustworthy? Can you rely on the information which is being shared? And I think the digital ledger technology helps us to advance some of these things, but also increasingly, as I'm hearing now, and the Australian government is very interested in verifiable credentials, and how do you make documents, whether they're issued by governments, in a form which is verifiable to the user or the recipient. And then you have digital maturity, because we can all talk about blockchain on one end, but if other players in the supply chain, particularly internationally, are not at the same level of maturity, we still have systems which end up with bits of paper in them along the way, or with hardwired forms or other things. And so we've got to accommodate all of that in an international supply chain, which is tricky. But the Australian government has also been signing up to a whole range of international agreements, and the model law on electronically transferable records itself is new in that sphere, but we've already indicated as a government and as a nation that we're interested in it in our agreements with Singapore, in our agreements with the UK and several others. So the intention is there, and we can look at that and have some hope. But from an industry perspective, how do we help move that along, and what is it where are the barriers and how can we overcome those, or inform the government on what it is that we need to do from a regulatory sense.
Yeah, thank you, Bryan. And just delving a little more into that. So, I guess, how has Australia already assimilated those legal nuances of cross-border payments and accepting electronic transferable records? I had a little bit of trouble getting that one out before. Like, what would accepting the ETRs mean? Like, I guess, how does that improve the trade processes that exist?
Yeah, I'm sure Alan will be able to give you much more in-depth conversation around this in the panel session. But fundamentally, again, if we step back, is the model law is a product of UNCITRAL. It's a UN system, which Australia is a member of the UN, of course, and it's got a suite of products which are all supporting electronic commerce and transactions. And it started a long time ago in the 1990s around electronic signatures. And if we go back to faxes, for example, is what makes a fax, a legally acceptable document, and an email. And we have laws then which have defined those things. And now we just have new technologies. And how do we make sure that our laws are principally based rather than embedding particular technologies or processes? And the model law appears to be an advancement of that. I'm not certain that we don't already have the conditions for acceptance for it, but it's the explicit acceptance, which is the important thing. And I was involved with the Australian Chamber and Australian Border Force. We're doing trials with what was called the Intergovernmental Ledger with Singapore prior to COVID. And it was the exchange of information using a blockchain. We proved that using certificates of origin to support the trade. It was a low-risk environment to start with, but they were only one direction. So Australia could send, or Australian traders could send information using the blockchain that the government had anointed, but only in one direction from Australia to Singapore. So Singapore could receive it. But as we questioned, well, where's the other half of this transaction? Well, Australia didn't seem to have a set of defined laws that enabled a trader to meet their compliance requirements if they needed to verify what it was they're doing inbound. And so the model law then came along about that time and looked to be something very useful. And I was very pleased to see in the most recent MyEFO update that the simplified trade system has been able to gather together some money and have that authorised by the government, so that we now have a process for the implementation of the model law in Australia. And it's over the next 4 years, though. And I guess the question needs to be asked, well, we wrote it into trade agreements, 5 years ago. What was going on then, and what was the intention? So I'm hopeful that it improves things, but it's also, you've got traders who are now in the UK or Singapore or other jurisdictions who have already got this explicitly adopted. What happens to them if they're using those things? And I do observe the commentary coming out of ICC in the UK around English law, and it's so long as your contracts are written in English law, then you should be all right across jurisdictions. But we'll have to wait and see exactly in each jurisdiction what's going to go on. But it's giving us hope.
Yeah, nice. And I'm sure Sunil will talk a little bit about XDC's abilities and DApps and allowing for the model law countries to accept full digital documents. And I'll leave that for the broader panel discussion. Yeah, you've gone really in depth there. I really appreciate it, into where Australia sits with its model law adoption. So do you think some barriers what are the barriers to that? Is it technology? Is it Australia's simplified trade system already operating with an assumption that the local model law adoption is incumbent upon us? What do you think the key considerations are here? Is it technology? Is it identity management? Is it security? What do you have any thoughts around that?
Um, it's clearly a complex landscape, but you have firstly digital identity and the need to make sure that the players involved are somehow known and traceable. But you've got also active work which is going on. The global tax system, for example, has identity systems, includes traceability, includes data sharing, etc. Well, customs and trade, for example, and tariffs are parts of the tax system. So how do we better align some of these things around the activities going on in the global tax and finance system, as opposed to just the customs and the goods movement system? Which brings me back to, these are some of the things which were explored in the Realising Paperless Trade series I did last year, and we spoke to a whole range of people, but industry is well advanced in this. The difficulty is that the regulatory system isn't necessarily keeping up with the technological capability now. And so things like the Australian Customs Act, it's the Australian Customs Act 1901. It was designed out of an earlier Victorian one in the days of sailing ships. And, you would haul stuff across the side of ships in cargo nets. Well, we're a long way advanced from that, but we still have artifacts in that act and the associated trade-related acts, which don't yet embrace what's possibly coming down the track around a Web3 world and a data-rich world, which it still embeds. There are articles in the Australian Customs Act which says thou shalt fax in, your information. Why? And here's some reform, that's easy to do, blockchain or not. It's, why are we embedded to that? People have moved well past faxes, and yet that's still in the legislation. So how do we move? Other nations have moved to reform their customs acts, to embrace the concept of single window things, so that we don't have all the multiple replicates of information going out of different systems. And industry trying to do that, which causes then a whole lot of mistakes. Is we've got better systems, we've got better technology. How do we start to think of trade in the digital environment? And we keep hearing as well, I'm on public record of parliamentary inquiries around the digital economy. There's no such thing. There's just the economy in a digital world. And how do we embrace, that and what we've got? We're doing really well, I think, in the finance sector. We've got a lot of interest from the Department of Industry and Science around quantum and what are we going to do for modern manufacturing and other things. Well, the trade system and how do we get stuff in and out of markets is vital in that, and we're not having the same conversation. So that's what I've been trying to do, is elevate this a little bit so that we can get some exposure on what's the world doing and what do we need to do to catch up.
Yeah, I think there are probably some people working in the global supply chain management trade world who have no idea what a fax is and have never used one, have never seen one, I'd imagine. And we may have some points of contention given our role as an industry association in the digital economy. Then we could have a whole nother debate on that. We could set up a panel at some point in the future and discuss. But I appreciate your thoughts. It is just that it's still just the economy and trade, but just shifting into a digital, it's the same, just in a digital format. I can appreciate that sentiment. I'm just being mindful of time. We've got a couple of minutes. You did, just lastly, you did touch on the point that industry, so there's a little bit of catching up to do from a government perspective. I mean, that is often a common theme across many different sectors, and perhaps some crossover here with the finance sector. Around that identity management and the global legal entity identifier services, and the Australian banks are rolling into the G-Leaf later this year, and those are the hot rumors at the moment. So hopefully some of that that catches up. Just thought with the trade single window concept, are you able to spend, just being mindful, we've got a couple of minutes, just maybe a little bit of time explaining to that, because there may be participants who are unfamiliar with that term?
So, well, again, a quick search, you'll get a lot of information on single windows. The concept's been around for a long time. It's more than 20 years old. Australia was a driving force around that as well. And remembering also that Australia is a co-chair in the WTO e-commerce negotiations that are live at the moment as well. So Australia's been a leader in terms of advocating for these sorts of things. In the mid-1990s, we introduced something called the Integrated Cargo System, ICS, which brought together some of the functions at the time of our customs system and our agricultural biosecurity system so that they are sort of connected together. But that system is now relatively old. And so the question needs to be asked is, well, what's the modern equivalent of that? And single windows are an expectation that a trader only needs to submit information once. But remembering it's a 20-year-old concept. So the trader only interfaces once with the government and all of its agencies do things behind the border. So if you like, in a simple form, a portal, but a single window is a concept as opposed to it being terribly well described anywhere. And so there's a lot of flexibility. And I'm starting to wonder, is there a 21st century vision for a single window as opposed to the 20th century one, which has been implemented by a number of nations to date? Is in a data-rich environment, is there in fact a new and different way to even think of what single windows are? And if I've got a wallet, for example, now, and I can put into that wallet all sorts of information about myself, my business, we have director IDs, we have tax identities, we've got the company information, we've got all the staff who are known through the reporting system for our superannuation, for example. I've got a lot of information, that's already here, resident with me. How do I give that access to the government agencies who need to know, to my commercial partners who need to know, but yet protect that, from abuse? And I think we're at a point where we can have a different conversation. And verifiable credentials, I think, is something which is coming along. These also appear to be supported by blockchain technologies too, so you get different use cases. But we can move from this forms idea of submitting information. And when you read the trade facilitation agreement and the requirements under Article 10.4 for that, it's a submission model still. And I'm wondering, do we need that sort of language in a modern sense, or can we have something which is more Web3 embracing, where information can be sought and requested by the computing power that's available and the types of technologies that are available. And we can have trust associated with that because we have all this information. And just not to labor the point, but we did touch on it before, is all of this predicated by you're a legitimate player. Yet there is this group at the sidelines and the margins who are the illegitimate players. And they are, actively abusive of the system. They don't pay their taxes. They are trying to rip off other people. They, are doing bad things with abuse of people in supply chains or wildlife or, forest products which are inappropriate, etc. Sanctions, a whole range of things. And that's what the government are also very, very interested in. And so when we talk of how do we improve the system, we always need to be mindful that the government are trying to stop the harm. So how do we work together as an industry-government partnership? Because we're all self-interested in a system that supports legitimate trade, yet makes it increasingly difficult for illegitimate trade and aspects, criminal aspects that we don't want in our societies.
Here. Greatly appreciate you sharing your expertise, deep expertise in this field of international trade and investment. Bryan, thank you so much for the discussion this morning. I will hand over to Sean White, Ecosystem Head of XDC Networks, to moderate a panel now on the tokenisation for the real world, compliance, business and digital trade. He'll be joined by Loretta Joseph, Commonwealth Secretariat on the model law for virtual assets. Bryan will join that panel. Sunil Senapati, who is CEO of XDC Trade Network, and We thank XDC for the membership of Blockchain Australia and their continued support. And Dr. Alan Davidson, Working Group for Electronic Commerce on UNCITRAL or UNCITRAL. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Really do appreciate your time. I think we managed to cover a fair bit there. And Bryan, thanks for all those 25 years of international trade and previous experiences there with the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. What I'd like to do is just quickly thank Blockchain Australia for helping XDC Network put this on today. It's a very important conversation. Tokenization need not just be based on assets as such, and it can also be done on mechanisms and processes. So without further ado, let's bring in our panel. I'm just going to read out a little intro, and I want to acknowledge everyone. So we'll do a little read through. So first of all, I want to introduce Loretta Joseph. She is the chair of the Australian Digital Financial Standards Advisory Council. She has a very long history in blockchain and initially very much a traditional finance member. Previously, Loretta was a senior banking specialist in derivatives trading across equity, fixed income, and commodities. Her banking career spans at least 25 years, has endowed her with a wealth of knowledge and expertise in financial markets. Currently, Loretta serves as a senior policy advisor and consultant to the Commonwealth Secretariat on the model law for virtual assets, while heavily involved with think tanks and advisory bodies. Welcome, Loretta.
Thank you for having me.
I'd now like to introduce Dr. Alan Davidson, who's currently Vice Chair of the United Nations Commission of International Trade Law, and as Simon mentioned, the UNCITRAL. Working Group 4, which is the electronic commerce, is what he focuses on. Dr. Alan Davidson is a senior legal academic at the University of Queensland. He's a senior lecturer and was a solicitor and barrister for the Supreme Court of New South Wales and the High Court of Australia for more than 3 decades. Dr. Davidson has since embarked on service to the United Nations, a subsidiary body of the UN General Assembly, responsible for facilitating and evolving the landscape for international trade and investment law. Good morning to you, Dr. Davidson.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for that introduction.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. And third member of our panel today is Sunil Senapati, who's the CEO of XDC Trade Network, which is a DApp built on the XDC network itself. Prior to his position with Singapore's Zinfin Fintech, which was the founder of XDC Network, Sunil served as the APAC Director of Trade Finance at Bolero International, where he demonstrated exceptional expertise in cross-border transactions, trade digitalization, and liquidity management. Current position as CEO of XDC Trade Network, Sunil now builds on his previous appointments where his deep engagement in blockchain and AI can be the trade industry game changer, impacting the face of TradeFi and its potential to readdress, rebalance, and streamline the business operations and financial equilibriums for SMEs throughout the globe. Welcome, Sunil. Sunil, can you hear me? Sunil, you might need to.
Yes.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I can hear you. Thanks for having me.
That's okay, my pleasure. So first of all, I'm going to address a question to each of the panelists today on the tokenization for the real world, compliance, business, and digital trade. I want to talk to Loretta. Loretta, you have a vast experience, especially throughout India, but obviously through APAC itself. How did you get from TradeFi to basically international digital blockchain facilitated finance?
Very good question. Greg Metcalf. At the time, Greg Metcalf is a very good friend of mine. He was running ASIC. In about 2012, he said to me, "Have you looked at this thing called blockchain, Loretta?" And I said, "No." So I went away and I actually read a book called Minecraft. Not the same thing. And I rang him up and I said, "Have you gone mad?" And he said, "What are you talking about?" Anyway, when we established that Minecraft was not blockchain, that was a very good thing. And I've always worked in financial markets. So my biggest bugbear as a trader has been clearing and settlement. How do I, like, if I clear an equity, it takes me 3 days. Some countries it's quicker. If I clear a water entitlement, that takes 27 days. If anyone can explain to me why, please do. fixed income can take a day. So as a trader, these things are very arduous. You have profit and losses that go all over the place because you can never control, what your positions are. So I looked at blockchain, not from Bitcoin. I did get into Bitcoin right after this, but I looked at how it could solve the processes of back offices, how we could make things more efficient, transparent, faster and reliable. So actually that was how I got into blockchain, and I worked with Greg quite a lot on that, and I saw an amazing opportunity of being able to use an immutable transparent blockchain, immutable transparent database to improve all the problems I had in financial markets. So, cut a long story short, that was how I got into blockchain. Then I got into Bitcoin, which became more interesting. So that was how I eventually moved. So I built a clearing and settlement system based on blockchain, not for the ASX, but for one of their rivals. And I think the ASX got a bit upset, so they went and tried to do their own, which hasn't worked. And ever since then, I've been writing policy. So I wrote the first policy.
And I just wanted to fast forward now. I'm very interested in your role at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Obviously, you've moved into policy advisement. I've read through your history. You've been very busy with corporates and nation states in itself. But you could probably spend a whole half an hour talking about that in itself. But let's just jump ahead into Commonwealth Secretariat. One could say the Commonwealth is one of those decentralized, apart from the UN, probably the most decentralized gathering of countries and nations. And once the UK left Europe, the EEC, tell me how did that come about, and what is your role, and where do you see things working for the Commonwealth itself in such a broad?
So I'd always looked at policy. I wrote the first legislation in the world for digital assets, by the way, in 2017 in Bermuda. I also wrote the first ever initial coin offering legislation in the world in 2018. And I also wrote the first ever security tokenisation in Bermuda in 2019. So I have a long experience in this. My lawyer friends on here and my barristers are probably going to choke because I'm not a lawyer, I'm a banker, but I sometimes think this helps. I do work with lawyers. So the Commonwealth has always been very interesting to me because we're 56 countries. We're 2.7 billion people. We hold more people in the Commonwealth than we do any other country. Regardless of what you think of the King, where we sit as Australia, as a public, it's a trade organisation, but it's the biggest trade organisation in the world. And the one thing that it has is that we all have exactly the same law system. We have common law. So I've always wanted to do this. So I thought if I could write a model law, and the Commonwealth write model laws all the time. Some countries take them, some countries don't. But virtual assets was, and the reason I did it on virtual assets, not digitalisation or blockchain, was particularly because of the Financial Action Task Force. I actually work for the ex-head of the FATF, Rick McDonald. I'm an AML expert now, who would have ever thought? But the Financial Action Task Force were the first standards regulator to come out globally in 2009 with the definition of a virtual asset. It's very specific. It's not a digital asset. It's not a crypto asset. There's so many different wordings, but their particular definition is very particular. And it's a virtual asset is a digital representation of value that can be traded, transferred, used as a unit of payment or a means of investment. That's very specific. Countries have tried to figure out what a digital asset is, a virtual asset. So I took that definition and we've written a model law to ensure, and I think we were talking about it just in the last session, AML-CTF is the biggest problem we have across industries. Bad, nefarious actors, money launderers, terrorists. And out of the 40 recommendations of the FATF, 14 touch virtual assets. There's been no one law globally that's covered that. So we've taken that and we've written a law which countries can either take in its entirety, they can take in sections, they can put in other parts of their laws. But don't forget, the Commonwealth is a very big trade organisation. Some countries are very advanced, like Australia, Canada, the UK. Some are not advanced at all. So we have the biggest emerging markets in the world. I actually work in Nigeria for the Financial Intelligence Unit in the SEC and in India. So they between them have a population of 2.2 billion people. So if we can have a standard law that goes across this many people, the Americans and the Europeans can go do whatever they want.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of Australia's focus is very much in the Americas, or at least the North American You know, we've got so many other regions, but you know, when you compare the Commonwealth to, you know, APAC, ASEAN, MENA, the African continents, I mean, there's literally no other organization apart from the UN that covers such a broad distribution of cultures, socioeconomics, and it's really quite fascinating. It's I want to thank you for that, Loretta. Dr. Alan Davidson, if I may just pivot, could you make the audience aware of the UNCITRAL and Australia's role in the Working Group 4, which is so heavily involved, and what part does this working group play in law and regulation of trade law in our region?
Thank you very much. I mean, it flows on largely from what Loretta just said, and that is that UNCITRAL was formed in 1966 for the purposes of harmonising international trade law. They passed the General Assembly passed a very successful convention in 1958, but they said, what are we writing laws for? Let's create a separate body. So they created the separate body with 3 different working groups, and they elected countries to go to it. Australia's largely been a part of it for many years, and you get elected to it. So it's not the whole UN, but it now represents about 66 countries, but they're increasing it to 72. So we meet together. I now represent Australia. I've been going for 10 years to Working Group 4, which has been on electronic commerce. But the intention of UNCITRAL is to do exactly what Loretta said with regard to the Commonwealth, and that is, how do we harmonise international? If I'm dealing with someone in country A, do I have to figure out what their laws are? Country B, their laws, country C, their laws. If we can harmonise it in some way, whether it's the Commonwealth or other countries, that would help quite a lot. In the 1990s, I often say this, that in 1995, if you ask me, if a person came to me as a lawyer, and I was a lawyer, I was practicing as a solicitor at the time. I did a degree in computing whilst I was a lawyer, which has got my interest in electronic commerce law before I became an academic. And said, Alan, I have this electronic contract. I have a contract which I need to exchange. Writing is required. I want to do it overseas. Can I exchange it by this new thing called email? And I think the correct answer in 1995 would be, I don't know. Because I don't want to say yes and then go to court and find out my client's going to lose $12 million. So in that environment, UNCITRAL and other bodies came along and said, let's create certainty. So they passed the Model Law of Electronic Commerce, which has been adopted by about 170 different jurisdictions. Australia was an early adopter in 1999, all 6 states and 2 territories. So we actually have 9 Electronic Transactions Acts, which says, let's get functional equivalence with regard to writing, signature, production, and a whole range of things. UNCITRAL Model Working Group 4 then put out a Model Law of Electronic Signatures, not widely adopted because there was already a signature standard in the Model Law of Electronic Commerce. It still had some 1990s thinking, which was fixed up by a convention, which has been adopted by, well, I will say adopted by Australia. It's been incorporated in all Australian law, although we haven't actually ticked a box to say we've adopted the convention, but we have adopted its provisions. And it fixed up some of the shortcomings of the Model Law of Electronic Commerce. So we have actual functional equivalence in relation to writing and signature, and many other aspects. Then, close to my heart, because I joined the Working Group 4 10 years ago. My first session was in May 2014 in New York. In fact, I'll be going back to New York in April 2024, so that'll be 10 years for me. When they were working on the Model Law of Electronic Transferable Records, and we completed that in 2017. It hasn't been adopted by Australia, but I know I am meeting with the Attorney General's Department next month, and our discussions will continue along the lines about what we can do with that. But it certainly has been adopted, the Model Law of Electronic Transferable Records for particular type of documents in international trade. It's been adopted in Singapore, Bahrain, but most importantly by the United Kingdom. Now, they didn't adopt the model law, but they adopted the principles of the model law and put it into their own words and actually made it much shorter and more condensed. I've said to the Australian government, I'd rather adopt the model law of electronic transferable records word for word, so that if the rest of the world does that, we have consistency rather than follow the UK version, and then we have only consistency with the UK. But sure. that remains to be seen, because I do like, they leave out a couple of principles in the UK, but they ultimately have adopted the main principles. We want to make sure that we have electronic bills of lading, perhaps electronic bills of exchange and other documents. I should point out, though, that the model of electronic transferable records is not for all documents. It's for a certain class of documents, which was left out of the convention. When the UN convention came out on international contracting, it provided functional equivalents for the vast majority of documents and signatures. But Article 2 of the convention said, we're not going to deal with transferable documents or instruments, including bills of lading and bills of exchange and so forth, basically because it's too hard. We don't know how to do it. So they left that out of the convention. And then in 2011, they said, they held a symposium that I went to and said, let's start up again and solve the problem. And they did solve the problem. So because the common law and the general law about transferring things like bills of lading is that they had to be pieces of paper. That with this document, when I handed the piece of paper by delivery, title transferred. Same thing happens with many other instruments, warehouse receipts, stock receipts, and again, bills of exchange. So that problem was largely fixed by saying the concept of possession equals exclusive control, and the concept of legal delivery is met by the concept of the transfer of that exclusive control. So that when I actually give you the electronic document, I no longer have any. The problem with old electronic documents is, of course, if I give you an electronic document, I'm also keeping a version.
There's lots of duplication involved with that technology. Dr. Davidson, I'm just going to throw to Sunil, but I do want to touch in with the more recent working groups with you a little later. I think more recently your working groups have been focusing on identity management, but thank you so much. That was a fantastic.
Can I say one thing?
Yes,
we finished a model law of identity management and trust services in 2022. Our current work is actually on autonomous contracting and artificial intelligence.
Oh, thank you.
We are a fair way away from a model law on that, but that's a fascinating debate that we're currently into.
You definitely have preempted my final question, but
okay. All right.
No, it's great. I didn't realize the IDM stuff had been sort of mostly finished up there.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Davidson. Sunil, if we can talk, how are digital trade practices being updated by blockchain? Bryan and Simon mentioned earlier how cloud and all the rest of it, this is not a new thing. This is a decades, or at least 2 decades, and I'm pretty sure you were involved with a lot of those decades when it comes to working through things being digital. But how would you say that digital trade practices are now being updated through blockchain? And would you like to talk about that, please?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So Sean, you were right in saying it is actually 25 years in electronic document usage in trade. So what was the reason this was not getting a full-fledged adoption? So technology, second, regulations. So there was no single technology. So we did have many attempts made by many companies trying to do their way using their proprietary technology, but then one was not talking with another. So technology was a key problem. The second was some countries were okay for it, some countries were not okay for it. So, a trade is always between 2 countries. So if one country is okay, the other country is not okay, then it is a broken, chain. So 2 things which are happening, again, thanks to UNCITRAL, WTO, ICC, regulators worldwide, and, so many of you out here, those who are pushing relentlessly to make sure that we have unification of standards. Why I say unification of standards? There are many standards available. So there was too much standards to follow. And I think that also is getting unified now. Like, Dr. Davidson just mentioned, UK signing one version of model law, not the full version. So, but at least we are moving in the right direction. We have 7 countries now, and more countries, partially accepted, and many more like US and others are, willing to join. Hopefully 2024 we'll see more country, start accepting electronic trade documents. So that will sort out the legal problem from a place where a country can actually consume electronic data to clear a cargo or to do all their necessary statutory works. Now comes what should be the technology, what should be the application. So the beauty of blockchain is you really don't have to have a particular technology. So as long as it's in a chain which can be verified across multiple chain, that does the job. So that's where blockchain excels. Now, what we didn't speak much, or I didn't hear anyone speaking, is blockchain actually does way too much, just unifying the application. It also helps us to seek data from multiple sources. If a data is available on any other chain, we could basically get the KYC done. So that's one of the key challenges Bryan kindly mentioned about during his conversation. So we need to make sure that a entity is actually that entity which they are claiming to be. So we have Glyph, where we can go and figure out whether, okay, indeed, this is the company. So before going and talking about what XDC Trade Network is doing, I'm just trying to put all the pieces together, what has been done so far. So blockchain actually can bring that availability of information that, yes, indeed, this is this company which is claiming for this cargo. And we can, always go back to Glyph and check their identity and so on. What is also required for the countries is when you're doing everything paperless, there are no records kept, but all the records are actually kept in electronic format. So what we are also doing at XDC Trade Network is ensuring any transaction done on our marketplace is actually adhering to the central bank's requirement. So I mean, it's very difficult to have all the central banks aligned to our solutions. So what we've started is we started working with Singapore. We are a Singapore-based company. We have aligned our solution. So our KYC is done with the guiding principle of Monetary Authority of Singapore. So just to give a bit of what exactly we do in XDC Trade Network, we are a marketplace where we onboard corporates and liquidity provider. The challenge of traders all the time was, I'm sending paper around to get my cargo received in a destination. Paper is always taking too long. And Loretta just mentioned that settlement takes way too long. So how can we digitize everything and also make sure the settlement is done faster? Which means we have to onboard every trade participant to create an electronic document. Now that sounds very challenging, to making sure that everybody goes through a change management and leave their existing application and start creating application on a blockchain. That is going to take super, super long. What we are doing from XDC Trade Network is, as a shipping company, let's say you're creating bill of lading, you continue using your bill of lading application. All you do is once you have done creating bill of lading, just push that into blockchain. We will enable this movement of bill of lading to a network, which is XDC network. It gets stored there and stamped. Now, Dr. Davidson also spoke about when I give something to somebody, I have a copy as well. But when I transfer it to that party and give it to him, and then the record says, I am no longer the holder, the new person who has this electronic copy is the holder. That is a beautiful way of handing over control to someone else. And that cannot be revoked. That is something which is done in blockchain. So our application allows trade participants to create trade documents and send and receive from each other. So that document can get created from the seller, it can receive the buyer. Cross-country, it reaches. So that's what we are enabling today. Now comes the settlement part. Now this was a hard part because trade finance, if you look at last 100 years, have been always managed by high street banks, which means somebody is going to be left out. Mostly SMEs, they don't have great balance sheet. They don't have enough line of credit from the banks. So they would always need more capital to do genuine trades. So how do we know which one is a genuine trade? So what we do is when somebody creates an electronic document, the electronic document actually puts a stamp and clearly says that I have this movable assets, which I am looking for financing it. Now that can be verified very easily over the blockchain. And then that gets financed by anybody who's willing to participate in trade finance. So we are basically democratizing this trade finance itself. So that's how we onboard banks, non-banks, family office, institutional investors, anybody who is interested in doing trade finance, because now it is easy to verify trade documents because all on chain, and then the financing can happen. And with the use of stablecoin, we can actually make instant settlement. So Loretta, if you hear me, we can actually do settlement the same day. So that's a very good news for any exporters. So there's a lot of work going on. No country wants to be left behind because the standards are now unified. Technology is more or less mature now. We can actually have paperless 100% end-to-end transaction along with settlement. All of that, like many other solutions out there, XDC can provide end-to-end.
Thank you very much, Sunil. It's definitely I mean, my role in XDC Network is pretty clear in this moderation panel, but the reason why I wanted to bring all this together was because the whole tokenization conversation, sometimes it's kind of spoken about as if it's something afar in the distance, but there's obviously blockchains, not just XDC Network, but we're actually providing real world use and real world adoption. I just want to open this now up to some more general and say maybe some speculative questions. Loretta, let's ask, looking forward, I mean, how hungry do you think the world is for broad digital adoption? And what's your perception? You're in a very specific and unique position to make a comment on this, given you're very much across many of the boardrooms and the Senate rooms and the back rooms of many governments.
Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a sec, because the first version of tokenization we had was Bitcoin. Regardless of what you think of Bitcoin, the first tokenization of money. Now, money means a lot of different things to a lot of people. We can all sit here and argue about what money is every day, but Bitcoin was the first tokenization of money. Now, we've tried many times. Yeah, we've had many ideas about how we can tokenize real assets. To be quite honest, today we're still not there. I have not seen one full integration of blockchain across any tokenization of any real asset. Now, there are three reasons for that. One, interoperability. Countries still don't have regulation. You do what we call the sunrise rule. Some countries have it, some people don't. Liquidity is a big problem. So when you tokenize something, you have to have liquidity. The reason things like IPOs don't work all the time is because you don't have liquidity. Liquidity is still going to be a big issue in tokenization. And I do a lot of work in trade finance, tokenization, just so everyone's aware, and also track and tracing. I work across 8 countries at the moment where we track and trace for the purposes of tax evasion, illicit substances being moved, counterfeiting. It's a big problem because of the corruption. The interoperability of the technology and the corruption that still goes hand in hand makes these things not easy to do. The other thing is, with trade finance, blockchain is still just a very small part of it. Blockchain doesn't solve everything. To be quite frank, people ask me all the time, oh, we need a blockchain solution. Quite frankly, you probably just need a better encrypted database. Blockchain is very time inefficient. It takes a lot of energy. And I'm not saying they won't be solved. The protocols are getting much better, the smart contract, but things like audits, even things like Polkadot. Polkadot was built by Gavin Wood. Gavin Wood actually wrote the Ethereum white paper because Vitalik was too young. You look at where the audits sit with Polkadot, that's one of the best protocols that I follow. Solana, you still have real problems. We will solve them, but like the internet, and I know this, my mentor is Bob Kahn. I don't know how many of you know Bob Kahn. Does anyone know Bob Kahn?
No.
It's very sad. Robert Kahn, he built the internet. He wrote the transmission control protocol, the internet protocol. His wife was a lawyer. And without his wife, Patrice, we would not have the internet as it stands to stay. He's been my mentor for 10 years at Open Systems. So I have an argument with any government that wants to say that I don't understand how open systems work, because I do. And he has big problems with this, interoperability and scalability. He still says are big problems with blockchain. And he's the man that built an open system. So we can't argue with that. But what I do see, and where my positivity now comes, I work across the emerging world. Now, what we've seen in the last 2 years, when I was writing laws in 2017, 2018 around ICOs, Bitcoin, blockchain, Bitcoin, Ethereum, nobody cared. Nobody really cared. Move to 2024. I've got to worry about DeFi. I need to worry about smart contracts, audits of smart contracts, the metaverse. Things like Web3 is now allowed entrepreneurs across the emerging world. Do I really care what Bitcoin price does? Well, by a lot of it, yes, but it's still a speculative asset and it's very volatile. So take that out of the equation for a minute. But the emerging world where you don't have access to a banking system, and I work in Nigeria, Kenya, Botswana, 97% of people don't have access to financial inclusion. We in Australia have 98%, Canada, the rest of the world. You flip that on the head, all of a sudden you give people a smart device, a stable coin, a wallet. You can create, with Web3, move value. We can transfer value and assets like we've never seen in history. And that is the killer app. And you will see the development of that in the next 6 months in the emerging world like we've never seen anything. So that's why I'm running as fast as I can to make sure that we have global standard, standardization, global best practices, regulatory frameworks that cohere, interoperability, because it doesn't matter what happens, to be quite frank, in Australia, Canada, or the UK. It matters what happens in India, and it matters what happens in Nigeria and Sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa and South America.
Which a lot of those countries are part of the Commonwealth in respect as well. Yeah. Fantastic. And I'm glad you mentioned the hurdles because, you know, a lot of philosophy can creep into blockchain and, you know, we obviously Web3 is a milestone and there's more beyond Web3, but we also need to respect and transition from all Web2. So thank you for that, Loretta. That was great. Alan, Dr. Davidson, just a follow-up from what you were mentioning before, and you pretty much introduced your own next topic, but you know, with a completion seemingly of the identity management working group focus, would you like to step into that and also maybe where you see things going forward? And I probably will ask you a curly question, but maybe just sort of let us know what you're up to now.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So many interesting topics that I'd like to be part of. But talking about this,
oh, please go off script. It's okay.
Oh, no, that's right. We after we finished the model law of electronic transferable records, our next job was to deal with identity management and trust services. I mean, I always think of international trade as the management of international risk. And if we can minimize, and that's part of UNCITRAL's role, is if we can standardize laws, we can minimize the risk by knowing what the laws are in various countries and various places. And that's a lot of the aim of chambers of commerce, the Commonwealth, and other bodies as well. So and of course, there are so many frauds and so many fraudsters who are stealing identities and pretending to be all sorts of people. I can tell you one I got yesterday on my phone, which of course didn't trick me. But anyway, as we all get those. Now, Europe had already passed a very good law called EIDAS, which is spelled EIDAS, if that's, which was basically identity management and trust service for Europe. It's a much more complicated, larger document than the one that the United Nations did. But we had a lot of the European delegates comment about that when we drafted what is a much shorter provision of about 28 or 29 articles. It deals with, now to me, it's the model law of identity management and trust services, but at the last moment, they changed the name to the model law on the use and cross-border recognition of identity management and trust services, a title which I don't like. But ultimately, there is a section in it which talks about recognizing other countries' laws and that our laws can extend to other countries if there's a reciprocal arrangement, hence cross-border recognition. But I don't want to talk about that, but it is important when we're dealing with international trade to know that occurs. Now, this was only completed in 2022, but for technical reasons, it really wasn't released until the last couple of months. So no country has actually adopted it. The fact that no country hasn't adopted doesn't make it relevant because you can take the key parts of it and put it into your own contracts or your own ideas, whether you use blockchain or probably other better technologies. It simply comes up with basic elements of the identity management that lists certain core obligations of identity management service providers. There are service providers who will provide this service saying, trust us. We are identity management service providers, so you can trust our information, you can trust our subscribers. It sets out a minimum standards for sets of rules on liability and for those bodies. a core provision, Article 9 of it says is a rule for functional equivalence between offline identification and identification carried out using identity management that requires the use of a reliable method. And I smile when I say reliable method because it took us 2.5 years to figure out what that means, and I don't know that I can explain it in 30 seconds. But ultimately, there are two approaches to figuring out whether something is whether you can truly minimize the risk in international trade when it comes to identity by having an anti-post approach and an ex-post approach and an ex-ante approach. One is after you've completed it, you can look at a shopping list of factors about rules and value and circumstances to say that we can determine after the event whether it was a reliable method. The ex-ante approach is if you have adopted this system, then we are agreeing in advance that this is a reliable method. So we've got both in there, an ex-ante and an ex-post approach. That draws a lot from the European version. Second, that's all I want to say about identity management, other than there is also a provision on trust services. So when it says it's identity management and trust services, I think the trust services is much more important because you want to go to a trust services, you want them to be liable. You don't want to lose $12 million and they go, oh, sorry, if you read our terms and conditions, we're liable to refund your fee if we get it wrong about, about this identity, about this public key, and so forth. And so there are similar provisions, and we want to have trust services for electronic signatures, for electronic seals, for electronic timestamps, for electronic archiving, for electronic registered delivery services, for website authentication. And I partly smile there because each one of those took us so long to do. The process in the working group is because there's so many people and they're all in different languages. What about half a dozen people could do in about a week? We take 3 years to do, and we meet once a week for a week, twice a year, when we get together. And it's a slow, tedious process, but ultimately gets the agreement of a lot of people so that we can have this consensus, so that we have a model law that comes out that eventually gets adopted. Now, this one isn't because it's brand new, but hopefully it's like our model law of electronic commerce from 1996. It's been adopted by 167 jurisdictions so far. But it also has an ex-post determination by a massive list in Article 22 and an ex-ante designation. I designate this approach to be valid for our purposes between the parties. One point that I want to say overriding this is the concept of party autonomy. Even if this is law and you're adopting its law in Australia and 50 countries, you are always free to go, I want to create my own standard between myself and this party. So between you and I, we agree this will be the standard. We don't, the model law is after all just a template for countries to adopt as law. And if they adopt it the way we put it in place, it's just a default set of laws and rules if the parties haven't agreed. The party's going to agree and go, this will be the standard. And if the other party doesn't like it, you go, well, I'm not entering into that arrangement because that's not good enough. Or yes, I think that meets my criteria and minimizes the risk. And then there's another section dealing with cross-border, but I really don't know that anyone's that interested in that, though it is significant from a lawyer's perspective.
But so I was going to say, I'll jump in on that, Alan. I think model law is important because it's minimum standards. And if sovereign countries want to increase that or use it, that's why model laws are so important, because they're just minimum standards. If you want to go way above the standard, do so. But the minimum standard, is something that you can use as your template.
Exactly. A convention is something you should adopt en masse. A model law even has places saying the exceptions to this shall be ... which means the countries can put in, because we do disagree on some things. Some think it's too far, some think it's too short. It is a model to either expand or change any way that you want to. But hopefully, like the model law of electronic commerce, the countries that have adopted it are about 90 to 95% identical in what they've adopted.
Thank you, Alan.
That's right. Good.
The theme definitely is coming across that it's a transition. We are sort of coming together in a very, very large task to sort of bring and drag perhaps all the players onto the table and perhaps bring everyone at least up to the minimum standard playing field.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah. Yes.
We deal in law, we don't deal in the technology. So we're a bunch of lawyers and bankers, and there's representatives from the World Bank and other places. But we always write the model laws in a technology neutral way. We don't
Except
say
for the facts,
use blockchain.
except for the facsimile.
Well, we do that. We're technology agnostic because I really do believe law needs to be technology agnostic.
Yes.
But we have
Absolutely.
experts. We have Bitcoin protocol experts. We have Bob Kahn. We have securers of nuclear facilities that help us. We have the actual the FATF authors who wrote recommendations 6, 14, 17, 19, 40. All the ones that we have the best drafters in the world. We have a group of experts. We have
I certainly hope so, because these things are affecting millions and millions and millions of people.
And we
it's
have
great.
probably some of the best blockchain technologists like Protocol. We have the guys who built the Lightning Network who help us on this stuff, because technically, like with laws, it's very, very difficult. There's no template. They didn't write this law, as we talked about before, Alan. In 1901, there was a customs law. There is no template for this stuff. When I wrote the first law in 2017, I had to make up a definition of a digital asset because nothing existed. But move on now, it's so complicated. It's not as easy as people think, and they get pissed off with regulators saying, "Oh, you're so slow behind technology." We've got a lot more important things to do than worry about technology.
And maybe also it's important to have that time, because then the technology can kind of and the market can kind of get used to it, transition, and also, bring out the best of the technology. So Neil, looking forward, I mean, we are sort of coming to the close of our panel, but I just want to get your take on where do you see, I mean, a lot of people see blockchain, or at least, using blockchains is a great path for sustainability, and for so many other sort of, especially with tokenization, we get democratization of finance and things like that. Maybe you'd like to just see what your thoughts are going forwards. Where would you like to see the technology and the laws and the use cases emerge?
Yeah. So if you look at adoption of anything electronic, leave blockchain aside, anything electronic, people will go based on their need. A large enterprise would not want hundreds of couriers flying in the air because they have hundreds of shipment going around. So how do you manage? Currently, it must be a nightmare for their documentation department, their export and import department to know which document is in which bank, or which is reaching where, which has not reached, but the ship has reached. Imagine the nightmare in a large, export house. So their motivation will be do everything electronic so that we know exactly, touch of a screen, where exactly this bill of lading is. So if they go electronic, they can manage all of that out of their desktop. SME, as I spoke, needs financing, and now trade finance is available if you are digital. So there will be many reasons why somebody would want to go digital. Somebody wants faster settlement. Somebody wants to borrow by tokenizing something, and tokenization again is a old method of making a token of something big and then distributing among multiple lenders. And all the settlements can happen at the day when the settlement has to happen using smart contracts. So technology is running in the side of lawmakers to ensure that it is supporting them as and when they come up with new standards. So we have, as a blockchain technology and as a solution provider, we have all the nuts and pieces of technology available to address the blockchain, the trades requirement, actually using blockchain as a technology. So I definitely see more and more country coming forward and doing the trials. We are part of all kinds of trials. We are looking at a pilot where data standard is being sent and received from different countries. We are trying to, get those pilots done. We are also looking at private pilots where there are actual transactions being fired. We are looking at supporting them. So we are in the middle of all of this, and we definitely see the future of trade is definitely looking very, very digital. And blockchain will have its fair share of contribution.
Can I just make one comment on that? I still think my biggest bugbear is custody and throughput.
Feel free. Let's open this up. Sunil, do you want to respond to Loretta?
Yeah. So basically, when you say custody of a document, or what type of custody you're talking about?
Custody the asset on chain.
Okay. So we do that very nicely. We have a digital custodian who is licensed by MAS, and we are also talking to many other digital custodian around the globe, so that we have every region one custodian where we could actually park a digital asset. The digital asset could be, anything. It could be actually moving cargo, which is a digital, which is in a digital form, or can be any of your cryptocurrency.
No, I get that. And the reason I say this is because I wrote the first ever digital custody law in the world, and it took me 4 years, and I still don't think we've got it right. To me, it's still a moving target, because custody is such a difficult thing. The throughput, the scalability, all that we can solve. But if you look at some of the insolvencies that we've seen recently with Celsius, with some of the hacks that we've seen, it's such a problem. And I don't think that goes is just cryptocurrency. I think that goes in blockchain solutions, in anything that can be tokenized.
You're absolutely right. Proving something on a piece of paper was much easier with a seal and chalk of a country, a regulator. Now, when you make it electronic, it is obviously needs to be verified by multiple party. And then if I have a cargo lying in Nigeria and I'm claiming that to be mine, do I have a proof which says indeed it is mine? So I need to get the relevant seal, the digital signature, which Dr. Davidson is talking about. So all of these have to come together to make the custody in the stage where it should be. So it's a moving target, work in progress. So how we handle today, if somebody brings us a bill of lading and say, I would like to put it in a custody, we put that in our digital custodian who is regulated by MAS. And how do we prove who that person is? We go to Glyph so that we know this is this company which we are talking about. Things like that we have in place.
I think some of the regulators like MAS, and I've worked for the Mauritians, that we still don't actually understand custody. And I say that from a regulatory point of view, because it's a very, very, very technical thing, and very few regulators around the world have the experience of having people that understand this technology.
Can I bring Alan, Dr. Davidson, to this discussion? Have you been listening?
Well, yes. I mean, I think of custody as a legal concept when you're talking about possession, or you're talking about property, and you're talking about constructive possession, and then sometimes you're talking about trust that you're holding on behalf of somebody else. And there's a different chain of events to understand what it means that there's for example, cargo in a warehouse that changes hands because someone A sells it to B, sells it to C, sells it to D, and the goods never move. In fact, there are a lot of frauds which occur where someone sells the same goods 5 times, and they can look in there and say, "Oh, the goods actually exist. Here's a whole bunch of copper wire," and they manage to double sell it and double sell it and double sell it. Because fraudsters are very good. Fraudsters very good on paper, and when electronic commerce came along, they are very good at understanding where are the holes and where are the gaps and how can we commit that fraud. And the whole aim of what we're all talking about tokens and initial coin offerings and initial public offerings and is minimizing the risk, because I don't know that we can ever eliminate it, because there's always someone ahead of the curve, so that you can say, yes, I'm trusting the goods are there, I'm trusting that this is the proper document, I'm trusting this is the proper person, because in all trade there's commodity risk and currency risk and party risk. There's all sorts of risks that you have to get through to solve that problem, and electronic commerce is doing that, I think, but slowly. Sorry,
I think the cyber risk of this is far greater than anything that we've ever said on paper, and that's just my point. I think the cyber guys are much better organised than we are, and the cyber guys are getting more and more and more. I mean, I work in money laundering, terrorism financing. If some of the stuff that I can tell you would make your head go very grey very quickly, and they're doing this at a rate that we can't keep up with in a month.
I'm going to throw to closing comments, but also if there is any questions that are filtered through, if Blockchain Australia would like to sort of bring them through into the webinar chat. Obviously, the overwhelming sort of impression I get is through this discussion, we've acknowledged that the Web 2 to Web 3 transition is real, but it's also something that presents its own problems. But it's also something which we can't use as a reason not to at least try if it's Web 2.5 or 2.8. But in that being said, there's always going to be the next web, whatever it may be. I'm going to go back in reverse order. I'm going to ask Sunil, and I'll give Loretta the closing comments. Sunil, what would you like to say in closing about digital trade and all the rest?
Yeah, so in my closing comment, I would like to take the two questions. These are short ones, but at least I think I can do it in my limited time. So, somebody has asked, Denise has asked, we have VTrade, we have TradeLens, both gone out of business. What can XDC do new today? Well, unfortunately, no work done in this space of digitalization is going to go waste. They tried to bring together. The only thing is, one was predominantly Maersk, which is single largest carrier. The other carriers would see them as a competition. Perhaps that is the reason why TradeLens didn't last that long. VTrade, again, IBM, really IBM was not having a focus, and then perhaps they were a little before time. Regulators are only coming now together, so that's how maybe the timing is right, because we have the tailwind from all the regulators, and more and more countries are signing up to Militer. So that's perhaps the time is right. From XDC, what we are doing differently is we are trying to simplify digitizing the trade documents. We are not saying that you have to create this application, create these documents in my application. We are providing this form free distributed through our partners. Partners can be anywhere in the world, so that the adoption of digitizing trade document becomes much easier. And then the sweeter thing which we are bringing is we are bringing liquidity. The moment you are digital, you get liquidity from XDC Trade Network. And if you're using stable coin, settlement can be same day. So these are the reasons why we feel that this will increase adoption. So that was your question, Denise. Then we also have some questions saying, is there a risk in trade financing? Any financing will always have risk, but we all know trade financing is the default rate is very, very low. ADP has the published percentage. So there's no doubt there is always a risk when you're doing a trade financing, but we are also doing, we work with insurers, those who insure these trades. And no, we are not a private blockchain. We are a public blockchain. We are EVM compatible. And you can see a lot more about us in zinfin.org.
Thank you, Sunil. Alan, did you get any questions? If you don't, I've got a great one.
Please.
I was gonna just, I don't know if you want to answer this, but where do you see peer-to-peer trade finance going in the next? Will we see it?
I think that the commercial parties are in it to make money, and often the greater the reward, the greater the risk as well. Now, that's not necessarily the case, but parties take risk. In fact, we want our directors of companies sometimes to take risk. If they're too conservative, they're not going to make money. We have business judgment rule. There's an expression that please take risks because I want to get a greater outcome from that. And then if it fails, you've got to go, okay, that was the risk that I was prepared to take. I think, yes, they will see that by dealing with each other, there are certain gains to be made from that. I would say this about, because I'm much more on the legal side and doing it from a UN perspective. EIDAS, which is the European version of Identity Management and Trust Services, one of their stated aims was, we're putting this out there because we want to encourage innovation. We want people to say, you can do this, and we want digital answers to be out there. They didn't say, this is the digital answer, but they said, because we're going to put the law out there and we expect the technology people to try and figure out a better way to minimize the risk by incorporating this. After all, blockchain is a concept that started in 2008. It's barely 14 years old, and yet it's something that is quite. We need as a concept,
we're going back to the 80s or the 60s even, but yeah, I get your point.
But not blockchain. Blockchain is Satoshi Nakamoto from 2008. No. Smart contracts go back to where there was digital cash before that, and there were versions of digital cash, but they didn't use that particular type of version.
I think you listen to Nick Zaubow, and you go back to the cyberpunks of 1962, and you go back to Bob Kahn, who, post
But they're all, but they were centralized, and they depend on other registers. The
Sure,
actual
yeah,
decentralized registers is something that is really taking over.
Yeah.
And I'm not
So
saying it's the answer. I mean, when we drafted the model law of electronic transferable records, we put in the comments that we relied upon digital ledger technology, although we referred to it, but that is not actually in the model law, because the moment we put technology into the model law, someone will invent something better and put it out of date. So it's got to be.
I'm going to take your answer as a. I'm going to take your answer as a yes, maybe. Let's see, Loretta. Do you have any? Thank you, Dr. Davidson.
That's right.
Just squeezing time in here, Loretta. Have you managed to receive any questions? Do you know?
I haven't seen any. Does it look like
That's okay.
but well, I'll just say, I really do think the tokenization of real world assets happens. I don't know how quickly it happens, but we're definitely, as we just said, blockchains since Nakamoto's only over 10 years into it. I've been in this for 9 years. The rate of innovation I've seen in 9 years, I can't even keep up with. So tokenization of real assets will happen, and it happens quickly. And I think that will be accelerated by the fact that we have exchange traded funds. Not that I'd ever do one because I just hold the asset, but mainstream people will come into blockchain and cryptocurrencies because of the SEC's announcement with BlackRock. And I think Web3 and the ability to move value and assets across open systems is probably the most powerful thing that we've seen since the internet. And the last thing I'll say is that I think the best thing that has ever happened to us, Sam Bankman-Fried and CZ going down, destroying this cult of personality of cryptocurrencies, has taken out that ridiculousness of that we had these crypto bros. That's gone forever, hopefully. I don't think there's two more people. And that will take blockchain to a level that we haven't seen in the last 10 years.
I completely agree, Loretta. Bryan, do you have one more thing you want to see? You've been on the wings. Did you want to say anything, Bryan?
I just wanted to ask Loretta, because you made a comment before we started, but and I'm interested, we've got Australians who are involved in these global institutions. How well is this translating back into Australia and Australia's regulatory systems, do you think?
I wish it was so much better. So on my Commonwealth, on my Commonwealth group, I have 6 Australians. I work. Greg Metcalf ran the OECD. He helps. He chaired ASIC. We have an ex-attorney general. We have a ex-tax commissioner who now works at the IMF. We have Rick McDonald, who's Australia, who ran the FATF for many years. We have more Australians on the expert working group than we have any other nationality. Now, why that can't be translated back into Australia, if somebody can explain that to me, I'm very happy to go and speak to Jim Chalmers tomorrow.
That might be a good time to finish up. That's I do see we have David Tatt in one of the attendees who wants to have a word. Are you gentlemen and lady able to just sit with us for another 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, I'm good. Is anyone else?
I haven't filtered David, so hopefully he's let me just bring him in.
I've had 5 hours sleep bearing in mind, so I may be starting to sound gaga.
Yeah, you're good. If David wants to have a word, just unmute yourself, David, introduce yourself and fire away. Otherwise, we have finished our allotted time, and I appreciate that we might need to end the chat. David, are you there? Maybe not.
He's muted.
I think we need to unmute.
He's muted, but I've asked him to unmute. Here we go. David, what do you want to say, David?
Hey, hold on.
You're good. We can hear you. That's at least good enough.
You don't. Work.
No, David, do you want to have the floor, David?
Hello.
Yep, speak away, David. Can you hear us? All right, we might have to I don't know if that's. Is he there? No.
Yeah.
David, did you want to say something?
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, go for it, David.
Oh,
who's the question directed to?
Yeah. Well, actually, one moment. I think it might actually be related to everybody in general. I've actually just started investing in crypto and blockchain probably about a month ago now.
Yeah, I'm not too sure if this is exactly the form you're looking for.
This is not financial advice.
Yeah, exactly. This is information education.
That's fine. I was just wondering in regards to what you'd be looking for in something like obviously you've got IPOs and things like that in like the stock market and stuff. And this, I'm just looking at how far along you guys would all estimate this would come into a mainstream kind of effect.
Okay,
Rather
I'm
than
not sure if that's
anything like
exactly the
AI.
sort of.
Yeah, that's fine. I can answer that question though. But I mean, I was a trader for 30 years. I've traded every asset class. No one asset goes one way forever. It doesn't exist.
Right.
And risk. This is a very speculative, very risky, very volatile asset. You do it at your own risk. You understand the
course.
risk, and that's all I can say on it.
Yeah, I think
this-
the main theme today was that we're progressively moving out of a Web 2 environment progressively into a Web 3 environment. Any of your own sort of interests are going to have to be done with a lot of research and a lot of exploration of the many different variables. But one thing I think we all can say for sure is that the world will keep moving forwards. And in fact, what Loretta says, nothing moves forwards all the time. So even this Web 2 to Web 3 is going to have its fits and starts. But I think we might leave it there today. I want to thank you, everyone, and thank you, David. I want to thank everyone here today, Simon with Bryan this morning, or whenever it was, morning or afternoon for some people, or evening. And I also want to extend my thanks to Loretta Joseph of the Commonwealth Secretariat, Dr. Ellen Davison, who was representing today from the UNCITRAL, and Sunil Sanapati, who's based in Singapore at the moment, for the XDC Trade Network. And thank you so much to Blockchain Australia. Thank you very much for everyone who tuned in today, who watches the recording of this. And long may you prosper in time and wealth and in energy. So thank you so much.
And big thanks, Sean. I think you deserve a big shout out.
I'll take it. Thanks, guys. I really do appreciate it.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. All right, cool. Hey, Sunil.